breaks my heart to say, we have come to it at last. The final Paul Bunyan tale. I know that some of you out there might be disappointed to hear that it's at an end, but I think it's better that way. We don't want to go too far. We don't want to overdo it. And I'm already at my fourth story, which is a bit of a stretch. But the way I look at it is that this series has been one of my most populars. The first one is my second most viewed video. So that I almost have to do at least one more adventure, one more song sung for the fascinating character of Paul Bunyan. And once again, we will have to return to North Country. Now, I will say, when I was looking through my records, I realized it was going to be kind of challenging to tell another one of these tales. Because we've already pretty much told the entire life of Paul Bunyan, from his life to his very likely death. But I will be telling you some more of my favorite adventures, and hopefully they are big enough for you. Hopefully as big as the man himself. So, as you know, Paul is quite an extraordinary fellow, but maybe you don't even understand just how much. He was always meant to be a lumberjack. When he was a baby, he would saw the legs of the dining room table, and his parents would always get mad at him for this, but he was just a timberman at heart. And he also created some huge landmarks for the entire world. For instance, his footprints made the 10,000 lakes. When he was dragging his axe alongside the road, he made the Grand Canyon. And when he was bathing in Niagara Falls, the mud that came off him was so bad that, well, it's still there today. That's why the water's so dirty. And I could also talk a lot about Paul's friend. You already know about Babe the Blue Ox and Bessie the Yellow Cow, but there's a few more that he has. There's Benny the Little Ox that was always following Babe around. I can't say too much about this character. There's not really too much stories, but I will say that supposedly this little ox loved pancakes and would eat entire shovelsfuls. And then there is some ants that decided to help Paul Bunyan one day. Paul was in need of workers. A lot of them had left because it was getting too cold outside. And Paul, when he saw these giant ants, decided to train them, and soon enough they were working around cleaning up the camp and even helping them with the timber a little bit. And apparently I've heard these ants like Swiss cheese a lot. It doesn't really have anything to do with the story, but it's just one of those interesting facts that I couldn't resist telling to you all. And then, of course, there are the lumberjacks themselves. Now, I know that I've talked a lot about these guys in the past, but I've kind of forgotten to mention how many times they got Paul almost into a lot of trouble. But luckily enough, Paul was able to save the day. One time, when it was a really cold winter, they made up a fire for themselves, and they were sitting around it, and they were getting warm. And all over the once, the temperature dropped, and it got so cold that the fire froze. Well, the men didn't know what to do with it, so they carried it down to the barn, and they set it in there, and they left. And when it warmed up, because eventually it would, the fire rekindled. And the whole barn set to flame, and all the lumberjacks were running around and screaming for Paul, Paul, and finally Paul came down and he stamped the fire out with his big boot. And there is one more friend that I still have not mentioned, and that is Ole the Blacksmith. Now, Ole the Blacksmith was a wizened fellow, and he's one of the few fellows that was almost as tall as Paul. Not quite. I would say he was a giant himself. No one really knows where he came from. But anyways, Ole the Blacksmith loved to make things. He was always hammering away, and he created all sorts of wondrous things that science today hasn't even been able to create. Things that fly, and things that went buzz, and made sounds. Just incredible things beyond the imagination. And the sound of him hammering away was so loud that people could hear it from miles around. It sounded like thunder, and they'd come and visit his shop, and they'd get some of these gifts. And one day, he was working, and he'd found some dough, and he came up with an idea. He began to hammer away at it, and he laid the dough, and he kept making holes and holes in it, and eventually he cooked some up, and he gave them to Paul, and that is how we have the donut. Ole the Blacksmith actually did like cooking a lot. He was a rather sourdough Sam himself. One time, he decided to make Paul some pancakes, and he got them in to grease the can, because, they needed a lot of grease to make these giant pancakes for Paul. And in order for these men to grease it, they had to put bacon on the bottom of their shoes, and they began to slide across it like it was ice skates. And Paul was very happy with this. Another time, Ole the Blacksmith made a giant piece of bread for Paul, and it was so big, it was as big as a house. And the lumberjacks would crawl all around in it, and they ate it up until it was hollow and lived in it for some time, made a little house for themselves, until eventually the birds picked it up piece by piece. Then another time, Ole the Blacksmith had Paul Bunyan go get some peas for him. And Paul Bunyan went and he grabbed a whole bag of it, and he was going down. The bag got caught in a branch, and it got opened up, and a whole bunch of peas fell into the hot spring. Well, at first, Paul thought this was a disaster. But then he had an idea. He ran back to the camp, and he got all of his men and Ole the Blacksmith to come down, and they had some pea soup together. And it was so good that Paul couldn't resist giving it to some of his other lumberjacks up north, and he froze some of it and had them carry it to them as well. And, we've about come to the end of the stories. There's not much more that I have to tell you, but I do have one more to say. And that is the time that Paul Bunyan, was planting some beans. As he's planting one of them, he put the water down, and it must have been a little bit too much water, and maybe just a little bit too much sun. Because all at once, the beanstalk sprouted up into the air, and it grew. It was as big as a tree trunk, and was just going up higher and higher, and it was going so fast that Paul couldn't even see it at this point. It was bigger than him. And the lumberjacks, and Ole the Blacksmith, and Sourdough Sam, and Johnny Inkslinger, and Babe the Blue Ox, and all of them came down, and they looked up at this amazing thing, this giant beanstalk. And, Ole the Blacksmith said that he wanted to climb up it and see if he could reach the top. So he did. He started climbing up it, and they all watched him. And eventually he got so high that he was past the clouds, and they couldn't see him anymore. And some of the lumberjacks got worried, and they began to call up for him, and finally Paul Bunyan let out a shout that knocked down some trees a little ways off. And Ole the Blacksmith yelled, "I'm all right, it's just very high up here, and the beanstalk keeps growing. I'm going up so fast." Well, all the men became worried, because now the beanstalk had almost reached the sun, and they afraid that Ole was going to just shrivel up. So Paul came up with a plan. He asked Babe to start lapping up the water down on the ground, and Babe did as he was told. And he lapped it up so much that the beanstalk began it began to wither. And it just withered all the way up. And it didn't immediately die, but it slowly began to, so that Ole the Blacksmith was able to climb down and make it to safety. But just before the beanstalk died, it hit the sun, and a whole bunch of popcorn came flying down onto the ground, and it looked like snow everywhere. And the animals all thought it was winter, and some were so afraid that they just froze to death then and there by the power of belief. But anyways, Paul and his men had some delicious popcorn to eat for the whole rest of the month. And yes, that is really all I can say. What I will tell you is that there are a lot of people that do say Paul Bunyan was real. Many who have said have met him. Some say that some of the stories are exaggerated. He wasn't as big as they say he was, but we know for a fact that he was at least very big and quite extraordinary. And who knows what happened to him? Again, he sort of disappeared. If you ask me, he's dead and buried off in the mountains, but I don't know, maybe one day he will return again. And at any rate, we have a beautiful piece of folklore for us. And hopefully there's be more folklore coming like him in the future. But for now, as you can say, sweet dreams and good night. Now it is time for some famous names from the Fireside Tales. Out there isn't a lot of creatures that know about the people that live down here. If you were to mention names like Barack Obama, or Donald Trump, or Elvis Presley, or even Alexander the Great, they wouldn't know who you were talking about. However, there are a few names that they will probably recognize. The religious figures, Jesus Christ, Buddha, Confucius. Not because I'm afraid of offending anyone, but just because people out there are really interested in religion. Sky is well known due to his significance with the Fireside Tales, and George Washington also because of his interference. None of it bad, I assure you. We here at the Fireside Tales actually very much love George Washington. He's one of our favorite presidents. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, too. I don't know exactly why. There was a case about this, but I don't know how it got such popularity. Malala, the girl, the Iraq girl that was shot, she's well known just because of her wise words. And Don Quixote, although he's not a real person, a lot of people out there think he's a real person. It's actually kind of humorous. And there's some names you all don't recognize, but out there everybody knows about. The biggest being Frank Bottoms. Yes, Frank Bottoms is considered one of the most important people to ever live in the universe. And all he is a police officer that lives in Missouri. Actually still lives out there, although he's a rather old man now. And Timothy the Turtle and Trevor the Hare, of course, are incredibly popular. And the Thief Prince, the man that almost slayed the Nightmare. That attempt alone made him famous. Most people wouldn't even be able to survive. But anyways, those are just a few of the names. But to be honest, they don't care about us down here making our bombs or having our wars or even at our times of peace. We're just noisy little ants. But don't feel too bad about it. A lot more things are noisy little ants than you might imagine. In fact, maybe in a way this whole universe is just a noisy little ant. We shall see. Good night, my friend.